let's begin. You've made yourself comfortable, and that's just right. Tonight, we're setting off on a slow, quiet walk through time. Not through battles or emperors, but through walls and arches, through brick and stone, through the stillness of cities long asleep. This is the history of Roman architecture, the quiet story of how the Roman world was shaped, not only by ideas and conquests, but by the hands that built it. There's no need to stay alert. You don't need to memorize names or dates. Let the rhythm of stone guide you. You're not here to study. You're here to listen and to drift gently into the ancient world. One where the pulse of civilization echoed through colonnades and courtyards, under aqueducts, and across the tiled floors of cities built to last forever. We begin in a time of promise, early in the Roman Empire, around the 1st century BC. Rome had emerged from centuries of internal unrest and regional warfare. What once had been a compact republic with a network of allied cities had now become something else entirely, an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the eastern Mediterranean. And with that shift came a new architectural ambition, one that would define the empire not through wealth or words, but through the landscapes it transformed. Roman architecture in this early period was about more than building things. It was about order, about permanence, about shaping a world in which Rome wasn't just a name on a map, but a physical reality, a place you could walk through, touch, and carry with you. In the early years of empire, architecture became the language of power and, at the same time, of daily life. For ordinary citizens, architecture was everywhere. Markets, bathhouses, roads, aqueducts, and insulae, or apartment blocks, filled their surroundings. Even the most humble Roman citizen lived in a world defined by structure and form. But before we wander those streets, it's worth pausing on something even more foundational. Not a monument, not a temple, but the ground beneath them. Because the story of Roman architecture begins not with marble or concrete, but with stone. Rome was built on volcanic earth. The city sits at the heart of the Italian peninsula, surrounded by ancient volcanic systems, some extinct, others merely dormant. And this geography gave Rome an enormous advantage. From these volcanic landscapes came building stones that were strong, varied, and abundant. These included types of tuff, a soft stone formed from compacted ash, pozzolana, a volcanic sand essential to Roman concrete, and travertine, a light-colored limestone prized for its durability and ease of carving. The earliest Roman builders used tuff extensively. It was relatively light, easy to cut, and came in multiple local varieties. Quarries just outside the city yielded materials like tufo leonato and tufo giallo, which you'll still find in the remains of temples, walls, and underground structures throughout ancient Latium. These stones were often used in the opus quadratum style, that is, cut into rectangular blocks and stacked in rows, sometimes without mortar. Later, with growing expertise and more ambitious goals, Roman builders turned increasingly to concrete, or opus cementitium, made by mixing lime, water, aggregate, and pozzolana. This invention allowed Roman architecture to break free from earlier limitations. Arches could span greater distances. Domes could rise above wide interiors. Buildings could take on new shapes, because they no longer relied solely on cut stone or load-bearing columns. This wasn't just technical innovation. It was conceptual. Rome could now shape space more freely, more creatively, and this would become one of its defining traits. The ability to integrate structure, form, and function in ways that made even the most utilitarian buildings feel harmonious, even beautiful. Let's walk now through one of the earliest Roman colonies designed using these principles, the city of Cosa, founded in the 3rd century BC and developed more fully in the early empire. Its ruins sit on a ridge in coastal Tuscany, looking out over the Tyrrhenian Sea. From up there, you can still trace the city grid. 2 main roads, the Cardo Maximus and Decumanus Maximus, cross each other at right angles. At their intersection sits the Forum, the civic heart of the colony. From there, temples, a basilica, and market stalls once radiated outward. This layout, the rectilinear plan, the axial streets, the modular design, became a template. Roman town planning followed a consistent logic. A city should be navigable. It should be scalable. It should express civic order through physical geometry. You'll see this in dozens of Roman colonial foundations, from Timgad in Algeria to Verona in northern Italy. Their streets are still visible today, pressed into the soil, lined by the foundations of homes and colonnades. Many even still retain their drainage systems and stepping stones, placed for crossing streets during rains. This was more than engineering. It was a world view. Rome's towns were often surrounded by polygonal walls, made of large, irregular stones, fitted tightly together without mortar. Some stood merely to mark boundaries. Others were defensive, although many towns under imperial peace had little need for fortification. Inside these walls, public life unfolded around forums, basilicas, temples, and eventually baths, all designed not just for function, but for expression. Each building was a symbol of Rome's presence. Let's slow down a little. Imagine the early light of morning in a Roman colony. Shadows stretching across a stone-paved street. The faint sound of footsteps on travertine slabs. A temple facade slowly catching the sun. Behind the scenes of this quiet beauty lies a carefully structured system. Water channels beneath your feet, stones stacked on earth compacted by generations of labor, lines plotted by surveyors and laid out by engineers. As the empire expanded, so did the reach of these ideas. Towns were founded in Gaul, Spain, North Africa, the Balkans, and beyond, all with a familiar rhythm. Rectilinear grids, public squares, colonnades, and stone that bore Rome's architectural accent. But stone, as foundational as it wasn't the only element in this architectural language. In the next part of our journey, we'll follow something even more fluid, something that flowed beneath arches and across valleys, carried in silence to the heart of cities. Water. Let's continue now. We've stood on stone foundations, walked quiet city grids, and watched the early morning light spill over temples and basilicas. Now we follow something softer, something woven into every Roman city, though often hidden from view. Water. To the Romans, water was more than a necessity. It was a presence, calm, constant, carefully managed. It flowed beneath the surface of cities and over great arches across the countryside. It passed silently through tunnels, across bridges, and into baths, fountains, and homes. And behind its gentle motion was a remarkable system, the Roman aqueduct. The earliest Roman aqueduct, the Aqua Appia, was built in 312 BC. Modest by later standards, it ran mostly underground, delivering water to the city from sources just east of Rome. Others followed, the Anio Vetus, the Aqua Marcia, the Aqua Claudia, each bringing in water from farther distances, using gravity alone to move it gently downhill, across hills and valleys, into the heart of Rome and beyond. By the early empire, aqueducts became a defining feature of the Roman landscape. From the hills outside the city, they appeared as long, elevated lines of arches sometimes low and squat, sometimes towering over 20 meters tall. They weren't just functional, they were orderly, repetitive, beautiful in their rhythm. Each aqueduct was a careful balancing act. Water had to fall at just the right slope, not too steep, not too shallow. The ideal gradient was subtle, about 1 in 4,800, just enough to keep water flowing without letting it rush. This required extraordinary precision, especially across uneven terrain. Engineers used tools like the chorobates, a long wooden bench with vertical plumb lines, and the groma for aligning right angles. They cut through hills with tunnels, sometimes stretching for kilometers, and built bridges when the land dipped too far. Where necessary, they used inverted siphons, pipes that dipped down into valleys and rose again on the other side, to cross deep depressions. Most aqueducts were made of concrete channels lined with waterproof mortar, sometimes covered with stone slabs or brick. Where they crossed open spaces, they rode on arches made from tough, travertine or brick-faced concrete, and inside the water flowed in silence, sometimes in multiple channels, one above the other. At its peak, Rome had at least 11 major aqueducts delivering water, some from over 50 miles away. Estimates vary, but they may have supplied the city with over 200 million gallons of water each day. But the water didn't simply pour into the city. It was collected, stored, and distributed. At key points, it flowed into castella, distribution tanks, where it was diverted into smaller lead or clay pipes. These led to fountains, bathhouses, gardens, and private homes. Wealthier homes could have their own water access. Poorer areas relied on public fountains, often placed at street corners or near crossroads. Some of these fountains still survive, worn by centuries, but still showing their outlines and basins. They offered not only water, but rest. A quiet moment on a warm day, the sound of trickling water, perhaps the murmur of passers-by. Much of this system was hidden from view. Channels ran underground. Cisterns stored reserves. Settling tanks, called piscinae limariae, helped remove impurities. Maintenance workers accessed the channels through stone shafts or vertical wells, keeping the system clean and flowing. And in this quiet network, Rome's architecture reached something close to harmony. Stone and water, structure and flow. Bathhouses, too, became part of this system, not only places of cleansing, but centers of daily life. The baths of Agrippa, the baths of Caracalla, the baths of Trajan. Each depended on the aqueducts to fill their pools, heat their chambers, and sustain the rituals of public hygiene and leisure. The water would arrive cold, flow through underground furnaces, and enter rooms at different temperatures: the frigidarium, the tepidarium, the caldarium. From room to room, a slow passage, steam rising from marble floors, water lapping gently against stone. It was an architecture of comfort, made possible by careful control of something as fleeting as water. Even in the countryside, aqueducts served Roman villas, sometimes even carrying water uphill using complex siphons and pressurized pipes. Wealthy landowners used it to irrigate gardens, fill decorative pools, and sustain productive farms. And yet, despite their scale, aqueducts were quiet. Their grandeur wasn't in spectacle, but in presence. Long lines of arches fading into the landscape, a steady trickle through hidden tunnels. They offered no noise, no drama, just quiet continuity. The pulse of a living city, circulating beneath the surface. With aqueducts, Rome achieved something rare, a way to move nature itself into the architecture of daily life. Not with force, but with patience and design. It's easy to imagine walking along the top of one of those long, narrow channels. The sun low in the sky, hills stretching out around you. Beneath your feet, the faint sound of water, slowly flowing toward a city just out of sight. You'd be walking not just on stone, but on centuries of thought, on knowledge passed through hands and time, set in mortar and arc. And perhaps that's what made Rome's architecture feel so enduring. It wasn't just what they built, but how they imagined each element, stone, water, air, light, as part of something whole. In the next part of our journey, we'll return to the city itself. We'll step into its monuments, its forums, and its temples. We'll look more closely at how these public buildings took shape, not just as symbols of empire, but as part of the gentle rhythms of everyday Roman life. Let's return now to the heart of the city. Water still flows behind us, invisible, steady, through aqueducts and pipes and into the basins and baths of daily life. But now we step back onto stone streets. Ahead of us rises the open space of the Forum. Not a single building, but a place where space itself becomes architecture. In every Roman city, from the smallest colony to the capital itself, the Forum stood at the center. It was more than a square. It was a living frame. It held together the civic body, a place where merchants traded, magistrates judged, orators spoke, and neighbors passed each other quietly in the morning sun. The typical Forum was rectangular, paved in stone, and enclosed on all sides by colonnades or arcades. At one end stood the basilica, a broad hall used for legal business and public gatherings. Its roof was supported by rows of columns, often with clerestory windows high above to let in gentle light. The space was large, open, and flexible, a calm interior within the bustle of the city. At the far edge of the Forum, raised on a platform, stood the temple, facing outward toward the square. These temples varied in design, but many followed a familiar form. A rectangular cellar, or inner chamber, surrounded on the front by a row of columns. The roof sloped gently, supported by wooden beams hidden beneath tiles. Inside the cellar, a statue, silent still, watched over the community. These temples weren't built to dazzle. Their power lay in balance, proportion, rhythm. The way a step led to a platform to a porch to a doorway. The way vertical columns and horizontal beams joined in quiet harmony. Many temples were built in what we call the Corinthian order, a style marked by slender columns and elaborately carved capitals that resemble curling acanthus leaves. The detail is delicate but precise. From a distance, the building seems solid. Up close, it reveals texture. The stone speaks softly, if you take the time to listen. Other forums featured monuments, arches, columns, statues, carefully placed to mark victories, honor benefactors, or celebrate emperors. But even these were part of a larger visual order. They didn't disrupt the space. They shaped it. In Rome itself, the central Forum Romanum grew slowly over centuries, layered with new temples, porticos, and basilicas. But in the early empire, new forums were built, each by an emperor, each with its own logic. The Forum of Augustus, for instance, was flanked by tall colonnades and closed off at the back by the Temple of Mars Ultor. The layout was simple, restrained, marble surfaces, deep shadow beneath arches, a space designed for reflection as much as ceremony. The Forum of Trajan, the grandest of them all, stretched beyond the older Forum spaces. It included a basilica, libraries, an open plaza, and at its center, a tall column, Trajan's column, carved with a continuous spiral relief of scenes from the emperor's campaigns. The column wasn't just decorative. It marked the emperor's tomb. It stood, tall and still, as a symbol of memory held in stone. Even so, the surrounding architecture was never loud. The Basilica Ulpia, with its high vaulted roof and long colonnades, softened the scale. The libraries offered quiet. The symmetry of the layout created a sense of peace, a balance between vertical and horizontal, between public space and architectural frame. Beyond the forums, other public spaces carried this same quiet clarity. There were amphitheatres like the Colosseum, whose outer arcades and repeating arches created a visual rhythm. Not overwhelming, but hypnotic in their repetition. And though the events held within were often loud, the structure itself remained calm, held together by vaults and concrete, with stairways leading gently to every level. There were markets too, sometimes built in tiers along sloping land, like Trajan's Market, a complex of halls, shops, and storage rooms arranged in graceful curves. Here, stone followed topography, form followed slope. The buildings stepped up the hillside without disruption, each level catching light in turn. All of these public spaces, the forums, temples, markets, and basilicas, shared something subtle. They were spaces not only of power, but of regularity. They offered shelter from chaos. They expressed something stable and structured, not through ornament, but through repetition, scale, and care. And when the day ended, these places changed again. In early evening, as the streets quieted, the stone colonnades of the forum cast long shadows across the paving stones. The steps of the temple cooled in the shade. The marketplace emptied, but the space remained, shaped by lines and thresholds and the memory of movement. Roman architecture, especially in public life, wasn't built to impress from a distance. It was built to welcome, to allow passage, pause, speech, and silence. It was meant to be walked, sat in, used, and returned to, and through it all, certain materials connected everything. Travertine for steps and walls, tuff for foundations and early temples, marble, increasingly common, imported and local, used for veneers and statues. Brick-faced concrete, hidden behind stucco or stone, forming the unseen skeleton of buildings that would outlast their emperors. None of this was accidental. Roman architects, engineers, and builders knew the strengths of each material. They knew how concrete could curve, how stone could bear, how brick could fill, and they built not only for today, but for time. These spaces remain, some in ruins, some reconstructed, some half forgotten beneath modern cities, but even now they carry their quiet logic. The curve of a colonnade, the lift of a vaulted ceiling, the weight of a lintel across two columns. It is in these places, these forums and temples, that we feel most clearly the intentions of Rome's architecture, not just to build, but to shape how people lived, gathered, and remembered. In the next part of our journey, we'll step into the homes of Rome, from modest apartments to grand villas, to explore how space was organized, how light moved across atriums, and how architecture adapted to the rhythm of domestic life. Let's take a quiet step away now from the civic heart of the city. The temples, forums, and monuments remain behind us, their columns still standing in the evening light, their courtyards silent. Now we turn toward the places where people lived. Streets lined with doorways, homes pressed close together, narrow alleys and wider avenues. Architecture not meant for ceremony, but for rest, work, and daily rhythm. In Rome and across its empire, residential architecture varied widely. There were insulae, multi-story apartment blocks, where working families lived, And there were domus, private houses for the wealthier classes, often set behind walls, hidden from the noise of the street. Let's begin with the insula, a word that means island, but in this context refers to a self-contained housing unit, often several stories tall. In the denser parts of Rome, especially in districts like the Suburra, these buildings rose beside one another, sometimes reaching 4 or 5 stories. While a few may have been taller, most were modest in scale, their upper floors built of wood and lighter materials. The lower floors of an insula were often made of stone or brick-faced concrete. These levels were considered more desirable, cooler in the summer, easier to reach, and less exposed to the risk of collapse or fire. The wealthier tenants rented these rooms, sometimes even with private access to running water if the building connected to the city system. Above, the living conditions grew more basic. Stairs climbed narrow corridors, walls thinned, ceilings lowered. The rooms at the top were small, warm in the summer and cold in the winter, often without windows or light. Yet even here, daily life unfolded, cooking, sleeping, washing, against the backdrop of tiled roofs and the quiet hum of city life. In the early morning or late evening, you might have heard a child's voice calling down from a wooden balcony, or the creak of laundry lines stretched between buildings, the smell of food drifting from kitchens, the faint echo of footsteps on staircases worn smooth by use. Insulae were part of the living fabric of the Roman city, practical, adaptable, and imperfect. Their walls were often patched, their beams replaced. Maintenance was constant, and yet they carried generations, lives layered upon lives. But not all Romans lived this way. Beyond the noise of the crowded neighborhoods were the domus, private houses built around a different set of principles. These homes weren't tall. They stretched outward, not upward. Most began with a modest entrance, plain, sometimes narrow, leading not to a front room, but to an open-air courtyard, the atrium. The atrium was the soul of the Roman house. Rectangular in shape, open to the sky, it often featured a shallow pool in the center called the impluvium, which collected rainwater from the sloping roof above. Around it, columns or wooden beams framed the space, and rooms branched off on each side, bedrooms, storerooms, small studies. Soft light filtered into the atrium throughout the day. In the morning, the sun would trace across the wall opposite the door. At midday, it would fall directly into the pool, shimmering gently on its surface. And in the evening, long shadows would stretch inward, cooling the space and quieting the house. From the atrium, the house opened further, into the tablinum, a kind of reception room, and beyond that, into a peristyle garden. This second open-air space was larger, ringed by columns, with walkways and flower beds and small fountains. Birds might gather there. Vines could climb the walls. It was a place of stillness, far removed from the world outside. The rooms surrounding the peristyle were more private, dining areas, guest rooms, libraries, and sometimes bars. These spaces were carefully proportioned. Floors might be decorated with mosaics, small coloured tiles set in geometric or pictorial designs. Walls might carry painted frescoes, gardens, landscapes, mythological scenes. Everything was arranged with attention to symmetry and light, not for show, but for calm. Movement through the domus followed a rhythm. You entered, passed through open space, and arrived in shade. The architecture guided your senses, narrowing your vision, quieting your breath. And while some houses were large and ornate, even simpler homes followed this pattern. The sequence of spaces, the open roof lines, the balance of air and stone, All were part of a shared architectural language. In cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum, many of these homes survive. Some are nearly complete, their layouts intact, their walls still painted, their pools still carved. They give us not only a view of how the elite lived, but how they arranged their lives, how architecture helped them rise, rest, and reflect. Farther from the city, the same principles extended to the countryside. Roman villas dotted the hills of Campania, Latium, and beyond, places of retreat and self-sufficiency. Villas were often larger, with extended wings for servants, storage, and agriculture. Yet at their core remained the same sequence: entrance, open space, garden, and horizon. Some villas opened toward the sea. Others looked inland across olive groves and vineyards. The rooms followed the sun. The stones held the warmth, and the silence between the walls made space for thought. Whether in an upper room of a tenement or in the cool garden of a villa, Roman domestic architecture carried a certain grace. Not loud, not ostentatious, but composed. It shaped how people moved, how they gathered, how they kept time. In every atrium, a shallow pool waited patiently for rain. In every insula, footsteps echoed on worn stone stairs. The architecture of Roman homes was not just a setting. It was part of life, shaping each moment, each season, each breath. And so now, as we prepare to continue, we leave these rooms behind us. The lamp has been extinguished. The garden is quiet. The streets are empty. And the door closes gently behind us. In the next part of our journey, we'll return to a different kind of structure. One made not for residence, but for remembrance. Tombs, mausoleums, and memorials. The still architecture of Roman memory. Let's walk now to the edge of the city. Not to leave it entirely, just to find a different kind of space. A place built not for markets or homes, not for gathering or speech, but for something more permanent, for stillness, for memory. As you moved beyond the walls of any Roman city, the roads were often lined with tombs. This wasn't by accident. Roman law required the dead to be buried outside the city proper, and so the roads leading away from towns, especially those that had been in use for generations, became corridors of remembrance. Here, along the Via Appia, or outside the gates of Pompeii or Ostia, tombs of all shapes and sizes stood like quiet markers of the lives that had once passed through the city. Some were large and round, made of travertine or tuff, with domed roofs and inscriptions carved in careful lettering. Others were simple, square stone sealed with tile or brick. Each tomb told a story, not always in words, but in form. The most elaborate were the mausolea, large, freestanding structures built by wealthy families. One of the most famous was the Mausoleum of Augustus, a circular earthen mound rising above concentric walls, planted with trees and lined with marble. It was both monument and garden, a symbol of dynasty, yet softened by nature. Another example stood nearby, the Mausoleum of Hadrian, later known as Castel Sant'Angelo, a vast drum-shaped structure of brick and stone. It was connected to the city by a bridge over the Tiber. Built to house the ashes of the emperor and his family, it blended strength with solemnity. Its lower walls massive and quiet, its upper terrace open to the sky. But not all Romans were emperors. Along the roads, countless other tombs belonged to merchants, craftsmen, soldiers, freedmen, and their families. Some bore niches carved into the facade, holding busts of the deceased. Others included small courtyards for offerings, benches for visitors, or reliefs showing scenes from daily life. Weaving, building, teaching. And then there were the columbaria, underground or semi-subterranean burial chambers used for cremated remains. The word comes from the Latin for dovecote, because the interior walls were lined with rows of small niches, each holding a single urn. These spaces were often shared by groups, extended families, professional guilds, or burial societies known as collegia. In the cool, dim interior, the air was still. The niches might be labelled with simple plaques. Sometimes a mosaic decorated the floor, or a fresco added quiet colour to the walls. Above ground, the structures were modest, brick-faced, flat-roofed, blending into the roadside. But below, they held the memory of hundreds. Roman funerary architecture was not about sorrow. It was about continuation, about preserving names, marking presence, and shaping the journey between life and death in stone. Many tombs had inscriptions, but they weren't for reading aloud. They were for noticing, for pausing. A name, a trade, a phrase, just enough to remind the passerby that someone had lived here, had walked these same roads, had been part of this same world. Even in their silence, tombs spoke. They reminded Romans that death was not a separation, but a part of the city's rhythm, as present and structured as the forum or the bath. Some families returned often, leaving offerings of food or flowers. Others rarely came, but the architecture remained, holding its shape against the weather, year after year, season after season. Tombs often included small gardens, just a few plants, a fig tree, a vine. In the evening, shadows would fall softly across the gravel. The stone would hold the heat of the day, and the air would still. There's something quietly profound about how the Romans built these spaces. Not hidden, not morbid, not exaggerated, just present, solid, made with the same care as the city itself. Even in the great necropolises, the cities of the dead, the streets are narrow and ordered. The tombs follow alignments. The paving stones are familiar. You might not even notice at first that you've left the living city. The architecture is the same, only the purpose has changed. And so the Roman world, in life and death, remained whole. The same materials, the same lines, the same sky above. Stone, in all its forms, carried this continuity, from the tuff that formed the walls of the earliest homes, to the travertine blocks of temples and baths, to the bricks and tiles of insulae and domus, and finally, to the urns and vaults that held the ashes of the departed. Architecture in Rome was never just shelter. It was memory made permanent. And when the day came to an end and the city grew quiet, these roads and tombs remained, not lonely, not forgotten, just still. In the next part of our journey, we'll look beyond the city itself, into the countryside, into sacred landscapes and distant outposts. We'll explore how Roman architecture extended into nature, shaping gardens, estates, and even frontier towns with the same quiet logic and care. We've spent time among the streets and walls of the Roman city, its temples, forums, homes, and monuments. But now we step beyond its edges. The gates fall behind us. The roads become quieter. The air opens and the sounds of the city begin to fade. Out here, in the rolling landscapes of Latium, Campania, and beyond, Roman architecture continued, not in towers or monuments, but in homes spread gently across hillsides, in gardens laid out beneath the sun, and in temples placed beside springs or groves. This was the world of the villa, part residence, part retreat, part working estate. Some were grand, owned by senators and emperors. Others were modest, belonging to families who tended their land and passed their days close to the earth. The Roman villa followed no single blueprint. It was shaped by land, by climate, by purpose. but most shared a common spirit, one of openness, rhythm, and balance between built space and natural space. Let's begin with the Villa Urbana, the suburban or countryside residence for Rome's elite. These villas were often set within large properties just outside city limits, used as seasonal homes during the warm months. Inside they followed the familiar pattern of the domus: an atrium, a peristyle garden, dining rooms, bedrooms, libraries. But here, the walls opened wider. More light was allowed in. Porticos lined the gardens. Colonnades framed the view. Many villas had crypto-porticos, shaded underground corridors used for walking, especially during the heat of the day. These spaces were cool, quiet, and gently lit through narrow windows or light wells. The floors were sometimes paved in mosaics, the walls left bare or painted in soft tones. They were spaces for thought, for rest, for retreat. Beyond the living quarters, the grounds extended outward, into orchards, olive groves, vineyards, and walking paths. Pools reflected the sky, shrines marked sacred corners, benches waited beneath trees. Gardens were not afterthoughts. They were designed with care, often shaped geometrically, with trimmed hedges, marble fountains, terracotta pots. Some villas even included nymphea, small grottos built to honor water spirits, decorated with shells, stonework, and flowing channels. Water ran softly through them, echoing off the stone. Farther out, the Villa Rustica took on a more practical role. These were working estates, part farm, part residence. Their architecture was simpler, but still followed a quiet logic. Living quarters sat beside barns, storage rooms, workshops, and slave quarters. Paths connected everything. Open courtyards allowed space for movement and air. These villas made use of local materials, stone collected from nearby fields, tiles fired in local kilns, wood from surrounding forests, and though modest, they were carefully laid out, reflecting the Roman preference for order and proportion, even in work. And still farther afield, across the provinces, Roman villas took on local shapes while keeping Roman structure. In Gaul, in Hispania, in North Africa, the same atriums, the same mosaics, the same quiet porticos appeared. Stone bent to the landscape, but the language remained Roman. Even in the farthest corners of the empire, Roman architecture carried with it the same priorities: shelter, symmetry, openness to nature, and connection to daily rhythm. And not just in homes. Sacred spaces, too, were placed in nature with care. Many rural temples were small, set beside springs, on hilltops, or near ancient trees. Their proportions were familiar: a raised platform, a front porch with columns, an inner sanctuary. But they were softened by their setting, surrounded by silence, wind in the leaves, water flowing nearby. Some of these sacred sites had been places of worship long before Rome: Etruscan, Latin, Sabine. Rome built upon them not to erase, but to integrate. And so the architecture here felt older, slower, more elemental. You might find a shrine beside a road, where travelers could pause and leave an offering, or a sanctuary at the foot of a mountain, its steps worn smooth by centuries, or a temple in the woods, where stone met moss and birds passed through the colonnade. Architecture here wasn't for display, it was for belonging. In these rural spaces, villas, gardens, grottos, shrines, Rome expressed a softer kind of presence. Not grand, not imperial, but patient, quiet, measured. Let us return once more to the city. We've been among the quiet villas of the countryside. The shaded cryptoporticos, the low walls warmed by sun, the gentle movement of water in garden pools. But now, the road winds slowly back toward the edges of Rome. As we approach, we begin to see them, scattered along the roadside, standing amid fields or tucked between trees. Arches, walls, foundations. The remains of buildings that once echoed with voices, now stilled. Ruins. Ruins are not the end of architecture. They are its continuation. The Romans built with permanence in mind, with stone and mortar, proportion and purpose. And those centuries have passed, and empires have risen and fallen. So much of what they shaped remains, not whole, not untouched, but present. The Colosseum, its outer rings partially missing, still opens to the sky. Its arches, hundreds of them, stretch in a rhythm that once held movement and anticipation. Now, in the quiet hours, they hold wind and shadow. The Pantheon, perhaps the most complete building of ancient Rome, still stands with its great dome, a perfect hemisphere resting on a circle of columns. Step inside, and the space opens upward. Light pours through the oculus, a round opening at the dome's center, illuminating the smooth interior in a shifting, silent beam. That light has moved across that dome for nearly 2,000 years, across centuries of weather, of footsteps, of prayers and breath. The building has changed. Its use has shifted, but the shape, the harmony, remains. Elsewhere in Rome, the baths of Caracalla remain not as baths, but as open walls, vaulted ceilings half fallen, mosaic fragments still in place. The silence here is broad. Even the birds pass through slowly, and the scale, even in ruin, is gentle. There is a quiet truth in ruins, a building without its roof, a wall standing alone, a stairway that leads nowhere. They remind us that architecture is always in motion, not just in time, but in meaning. What was once a courthouse becomes a garden. What was once a temple becomes a frame for the sky. And yet, even in their broken state, Roman structures continue to speak. Not loudly, not urgently, but with patience. The arches still teach us balance, the columns, proportion, the spaces between, how to breathe. Even underground, in the buried levels of the Roman Forum or beneath the basilicas of later centuries, you can still find walls made of ancient concrete, opus cementicum, rough and strong, laid with a rhythm that has outlasted its builders. These materials, stone, brick, concrete, hold memory not because they are unchanged, but because they've endured change. The builders of these places never saw them as ruins. They saw them as living forms. And yet, in their brokenness, there's still life. Grass between paving stones, ivy along an arcade, light spilling through a collapsed roof into an empty courtyard. In many ways, the architecture of Rome remains because it was not built to overwhelm, but to integrate. It fit the landscape. It respected balance. It invited air and time to pass through it. Centuries after the empire faded, poets, artists, and travelers came to see these ruins, not just as objects, but as experiences. They felt the melancholy of broken temples, the awe of silent baths, the calm of a once crowded street now covered in moss and shade. And from these impressions, the idea of Rome endured. The Renaissance found in Roman ruins a foundation for new thought. Architects studied its columns and copied its ratios. But more than that, they listened to the stillness, to the way a building could hold space without filling it, to the way a ruin could teach. Today, when we walk through what remains, we don't see only what is gone. We see what continues. We see arches that support nothing, but still frame the sky. We see walls that no longer protect, but still guide the light. Roman architecture has become something more than its materials. It is a memory we share, a shared understanding of what it means to build something well, something thoughtful, something lasting. And so, even now, as the day turns to evening and the light grows soft, Rome remains, not as it was, but as it has become, a city of layers, a structure of echoes, a place where time moves slowly, and where stone, shaped by ancient hands, still stands in quiet conversation with the wind. In the final part of our journey, we'll bring this all together. We'll return to the beginning, to the materials, the spaces, the intentions, and reflect on what Roman architecture offers us today, not as a lesson, but as a presence, a calm and steady shape in the long rhythm of history. You've walked the streets of ancient cities. You've passed beneath arches, stood in shaded courtyards, followed the line of an aqueduct, and rested beneath a painted ceiling. And now you've arrived here, not at an ending, but at a place of stillness. Roman architecture was never about one moment. It didn't belong only to emperors or armies. It wasn't only found in marble or gold. It lived in the stones beneath your feet, in the careful slope of a roof, in the rhythm of columns leading you inward or outward, or nowhere at all. It lived in walls that carried water, and in stairways that led to quiet rooms. It lived in spaces shaped for rest, for breath, for the passing of seasons. And though much of it has weathered, what remains still carries that same intention. To hold space for life, for memory, for sleep. The domes, the courtyards, the colonnades, they all invited a kind of awareness. Not sharp, not busy, but slow, measured, grounded. That's what makes Roman architecture so enduring. It was made with care, not only for strength or pride or beauty, but for alignment, for the joining of purpose and place, even in the simplest forms. A doorway framed in tuff, a water basin carved from stone, a villa wall warmed by the afternoon sun. The architecture guided movement without command. It shaped time without measuring it. It asked nothing. It simply waited. In that way, these buildings still wait for us. They're not gone, not even broken. They are only quieter now. And in that quiet, we can still walk their paths. We can still stand at the threshold of a temple as the light changes. Still feel the breath of cool air as we step into a vaulted hall. Still follow the curve of a garden wall, our steps slow, unhurried. You haven't needed to remember every term or every name. You haven't needed to hold every image. You've only had to rest in the rhythm, the soft unfolding of space through time. Because that's what Roman architecture is, not a collection of buildings, but a long exhale, a geometry of peace. And so now, the stones return to silence, the arches fade into the dusk, the paths wind away from the noise of day, and the city, once more, falls asleep, just as you do now, slowly, easily, without end. Good night.